Good to go? All right, let's turn this microphone on. All right. Okay, so my name is Marc Newlin, and I work as a security researcher at Bastille Networks down in Atlanta. And so I spend a lot of time working with software-defined radios and specifically looking at the security of wireless devices and wireless protocols. And I've taken kind of a non-standard path to get into security research, so I just want to touch on that for a minute. So in 2011, DARPA had this thing called the Shredder Challenge. And this is a competition they put on to figure out how to reassemble shredded documents. So the idea was they shredded a bunch of documents with different levels of complexity of shredders, scanned in these pieces of paper by hand, and then provided the digitized shredded documents to teams to reassemble. So I signed up for that on a whim, ended up writing some pretty neat software, and managed to finish that in third place out of 9,000 or so teams. And it was a really fun experience. And so I decided that I would sign up for any future DARPA challenges that sounded potentially feasible to do in my spare time. So in 2013, DARPA announced the Spectrum Challenge. So it was a SDR hacking competition. And so I signed up, but the problem was I didn't actually know what SDR was. So there was this 3-week period between signing up for the challenge and the qualifying round. And I managed to learn just enough in that 3-week period to qualify as a finalist in the competition. And so I spent my next year of 2013 and part of 2014 learning about SDR and competing in this. And I managed to finish one of the tournaments in second place and had the fun distinctions of being the only solo finalist team. And I was also the only finalist who hadn't gone to college. Then through the Spectrum Challenge, I found my way to Bastille because our chief engineer was running the GTRI team in the challenge. Then at Bastille, I've been doing some wireless hacking stuff, and specifically the MouseJack and KeySniffer vulnerabilities, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So the scope of this talk is 16 vulnerabilities I discovered in non-Bluetooth wireless keyboards and mice. These are 16 different vendors and 16 vulnerabilities, but some of the vulnerabilities affect multiple vendors, and some vendors are affected by multiple vulnerabilities. It's all non-Bluetooth proprietary protocols. So there are 4 different families of transceivers used in these devices. And it's mostly keystroke, sniffing, and injection vulnerabilities. And most of the devices can't be patched due to hardware limitations. So on the keystroke injection side, we have cases where we can send unencrypted keystroke packets to the USB dongle paired with either a mouse or keyboard. So in this case, we're spoofing a device and just sending an unencrypted keystroke packet to a USB dongle. Now we have other cases where we can actually generate our own encrypted keystroke packets without knowledge of the AES key and do encrypted keystroke injection into keyboard dongles. Then we have a number of keyboards which are completely unencrypted, and these are all vulnerable to sniffing as well as injection. There's some forced pairing vulnerabilities affecting the Logitech unifying devices, as well as some white-labeled Dell hardware. There's a malicious macro programming bug affecting a Logitech gaming mouse. We can actually maliciously program a macro into somebody's mouse wirelessly and then have it execute this keystroke macro the next time they hit a certain key on their mouse. And then finally, there's some denial of service vulnerabilities affecting a number of Lenovo products. And so you might think that these kind of vulnerabilities will be more common with these second-tier, lesser-known vendors. But it turns out that really everybody makes vulnerable devices. And so everybody on this list has at least one keystroke injection vulnerability in a keyboard or mouse, and most have keystroke sniffing and other vulnerabilities as well. And I'm going to read a list because I love doing this. It's Logitech, HP, Microsoft, Dell, Anker, Lenovo, Toshiba, Amazon, Gigabyte, Insignia, Schmaus, HDE, GE Jasco, RadioShack, EagleTech, and Kensington. And so this started out as a Logitech project, but quickly ballooned into an industry-wide project. So before I continue, I want to talk about some prior research that's been done in this space. So in 2010, Thorsten Schroeder and Max Moser discovered that the XOR encryption used on certain Microsoft wireless keyboards was weak and vulnerable to sniffing and injection. And what they discovered is that Microsoft was just XORing the payload, the wireless payload, with the wireless address. And so you could simply receive a payload, receive the address, XOR them together, and get out your data. So Thorsten and Max built this, basically a custom SDR type thing to sniff keystrokes from these XOR encrypted Microsoft keyboards. And it worked pretty well, but the barrier to entry was very high because it was custom hardware. So in 2011, Travis Goodspeed figured out that you can invoke kind of a pseudo-promiscuous mode on these common Nordic semiconductor transceivers, and he demonstrated that you can do the same kind of keystroke sniffing, but using commodity hardware. And then last year, Sammy Kamkar built this thing called KeySweeper, which is a little USB wall adapter, and inside he had an Arduino and a GSM radio and a Nordic radio, and demonstrated sniffing keystrokes from these same Microsoft keyboards and transmitting them over a GSM backhaul. So when you think about mice and keyboards communicating with a computer, it's easy to think of the peripheral and the computer talking to each other and having knowledge of each other. But really, there are two links that we can look at here. So first, when you move your mouse or type on a keyboard, the mouse or keyboard will generate radio packets based on those actions and transmit them to the USB dongle. And the mouse or keyboard doesn't know that there's a computer on the other end. It just knows that it's sending these packets to a USB dongle. And then on the other side, the USB dongle receives these packets from the mouse or keyboard, decides what the user action was, and generates USB human interface device packets, which it sends to the host computer. And just as the mouse or keyboard doesn't know about the computer doesn't know about the mouse or keyboard. All it knows is this thing plugged into its side is telling it there was a keystroke or mouse movement. So we can do keystroke injection by taking advantage of the second half of this link. And in these cases, we're actually sending our own spoofed radio packets directly to a USB dongle plugged into somebody's computer and crafting them in such a way that we can cause a USB dongle to generate a keystroke of our choosing. Then the keystroke sniffing vulnerabilities take advantage of the other half of the link. So you have these unencrypted keyboards, and so when you type on them, it's sending this unencrypted keyboard data over the air. And just as the USB dongle associated with the keyboard can receive those keystrokes, an attacker can also receive those keystrokes and determine what was being typed. So when I started this project, it wasn't a vulnerability research project, and I wasn't on the research team at work. I had done a lot of work implementing SDR decoders for known and documented protocols, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and those sort of things. But I didn't have any experience doing reverse engineering of wireless protocols. And so my first target was the Logitech M510 mouse I was using, because it was easy and on my desk. And so I started doing some research to try and find out what information Logitech had previously published about how their wireless mice and keyboards communicate. And I came across this quote from a white paper from 2009. And they say, since the displacements of a mouse would not give any useful information to a hacker, the mouse reports are not encrypted. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if all you can do is eavesdrop on where a mouse moves and when it clicks, you're not really going to lose any important information. But because they use the word hacker in here, I decided that I was going to find something wrong with it. So I started with this USRP B210 software-defined radio, and I implemented a physical layer decoder for the transceiver that Logitech uses in these wireless mice and keyboards. And this made it possible to see the raw bytes that were being sent over the air between the keyboard and the dongle. And because the mouse is unencrypted, it made it possible to determine pretty easily what the packet format was. So I could click a button on the mouse and move it around, see what changed over the air, and work out what the payload format was. And from there, I could start to work out what the basic behavior was, so what is channel hopping, timing, all these things. And this made it possible to get a pretty good understanding of how the mouse and dongle communicate with each other. But the problem was, timing constraints made it difficult to do two-way communication. So for example, if you want to spoof a dongle, you need to be able to receive a packet from a mouse and then reply with an ACK within a certain timeout. And on these devices, the ACK timeouts are typically on the order of microseconds or 1 or 2 milliseconds. And so if you have an SDR decoder, by the time your computer knows it needs to send an ACK, the ACK timeout is likely already elapsed. So I needed some more purpose-built hardware. So conveniently, at this time last summer, I was also getting ready for Burning Man. And for Burning Man, I built this big LED covered top hat. And as you do when you build a big LED covered top hat, I built a wireless NES controller to communicate with the hat and control it. So in the NES controller, I had an Arduino and a Nordic radio and some batteries. And I was working on this top hat at the same time as this Logitech project. And I had this revelation that I could write firmware for the controller to control Logitech mice. And this was then about a week before last DEF CON. And so I set up the NES controller so that it would look for nearby Logitech wireless mice. When it found one, it would start injecting packets to that address. So I could use the D-pad to move somebody's cursor around, right and left click with the A and B buttons. But the problem was at DEF CON last year, there were so many of these Logitech mice, I would have no idea whose computer I was messing with. And so I added this mayhem button. And the mayhem button, as it sounds, induces mayhem. And so it generates random movement and click packets and transmits them to the mouse that I'm currently controlling. So I would hold that down, look around, see who's pissed off at their friends or ripping out the USB dongle or whatever. And so it turned out to be a pretty fun toy for trolling people. And then I made my way over to the IoT village at DEF CON last year. And this was great because they were actually using a Logitech mouse for their presentation clicker. So I had some fun with expected results, and I wrote this haiku to sum up the experience. IoT village, a Logitech mouse clicker, did not like the hacks. And so they actually didn't realize it was somebody in close proximity. They thought somebody had installed malware on their computer, so they left this kind post-it note asking me to stop fucking with them, which I did. And so I got back from DEF CON last year, and I always make things more complicated because that's just what my brain does. And so I added this OLED display to the controller, and this solved the problem of not knowing what devices I was talking to, because I could then visually enumerate the nearby Logitech mice, select a specific mouse, and then control that. And so on this display here, the asterisk next to the channel number on the right indicates activity, so I could correlate somebody moving their mouse with the asterisk showing up on the OLED display and figure out what mouse it was. And then I also decided to cram all kinds of things to the inside. So I upgraded from Arduino to a TNZ, added a LiPo battery, ended up with 5 Nordic radios. That was just the limit of what I could fit in the thing. And this made it possible to do some pretty neat stuff. Namely, I could look at a bunch of different devices at a time, record telemetry, and so forth. So I went and gave a talk about the NES controller at TorCon last year. And the problem was I hadn't found any vulnerabilities. And so I implemented this on-screen keyboard attack. And so you can actually, with Windows 8.1 and Windows 10, you can send deterministic mouse movements to a computer and cause it to bring up the on-screen keyboard and then put it in the split view. And they call this tablet mode because if you're on a tablet or touchscreen device, you can use a thumb for each corner. Now what's nice is you can get this up without seeing the screen, and then you can move the cursor to the bottom right or bottom left corner of the screen, just go way left and way down and so forth. And then you can go up and over a fixed number of pixels to type certain letters on the keyboard. And this is functionally just fine, but very impractical because you have to go very, very slow to avoid cursor acceleration kicking in. And the end result is 1 to 3 seconds per letter. So it'd be very obvious if you're using type on somebody's computer. So I got back from TorCon last year, and the project had really run its course at this point, at least so I thought. I had built this toy, gave a talk, learned some stuff, but hadn't found any vulnerabilities. And so I was getting back to my regular daily obligations. And I just had this gut feeling that there was more to find. So I kept poking around, I kept working on this in my spare time. And at this point, I had a really good understanding of how the Logitech unifying protocol works. I knew what the mouse data looked like when the USB dongle sends it to the host computer. I knew what it looked like over the air. And I could see that there was a parallel between what a keystroke and mouse movement packet looked like to the host computer. They were very, very similar. And the keystroke packets were encrypted going over the air, but I could infer what a keystroke packet might look like if they were unencrypted going over the air. So I tried this and sent it, and sure enough, it worked, and to just send unencrypted keystrokes to these Logitech unifying dongles. And this kind of blew my mind, because I had always assumed that vulnerability research was going to be hard or somehow require esoteric skills I didn't have. So I got really excited, and I just started buying mice and keyboards. And so pretty soon, I had amassed this big collection of wireless mice and keyboards. And the problem was, I have all these devices, but now if I want to evaluate them all, I need to be really, really efficient, because 50 devices, I can't spend a week on each one. So my general strategy was to just pwn all the peripherals, and it actually worked for most of them. So I would start by gathering some open source intelligence on the physical layer operating characteristics of a device. So this is, what information do we need to implement an SDR decoder to see what bits and bytes are going over the air? And so primarily this comes from test reports. So when you have a device with a radio in it that you sell in the US, you have to go through this FCC certification process. And part of that process is characterizing how the device behaves. That's going to be what frequencies is it on, what are the channel widths, in some cases modulation information. So that's a good start. And then for a lot of the devices that use these Nordic chips or TI chips that have well-documented packet formats, I would then take that information. I would Google around and see if there's any price. And in the end, everything ended up being its proprietary protocols, GFSK modulation, a handful of data rates, so all pretty similar, pretty homogeneous. And so after we had this SDR decoder implemented, the next step was to build out a model for the protocol. And so with SDR decoder, I could see what bits and bytes are going over the air. And then I would take each device, I would move it around, click the buttons, type on the keyboard, and start to characterize how the device behaved. So for the unencrypted things like mice and unencrypted keyboards, it was very, very apparent. But for the encrypted devices, I could at least say this is encrypted, it uses frequency hopping and so forth. And I would build out as many characteristics as I could. And once I had this basic model for each device, then I would look for low-hanging fruit. And in the case of something like an unencrypted board, it's really, really easy, because then it's unencrypted, so you can do keystroke sniffing and injection. Every single mouse I looked at was unencrypted, surprisingly. In some cases, like the Logitech stuff, where it's sending basically USB HID over the air, I would try changing that from a mouse HID packet to a keyboard HID packet, and so forth. Then for the keyboards, I would look for things like unencryption is vulnerable to replay attacks. There's some interesting encrypted keystroke injection replay stuff, which we'll get to. So then if there wasn't any low-hanging fruit, then I would start fuzzing. And the premise here is that if you can send unexpected input to a device or system and see if it produces any unexpected results. So in this case, I would have a USB dongle from a mouse plugged into my computer. I would have either an SDR or the NES controller transmitting to that USB dongle. And I would send stuff that looked like what the actual data would be, but it would be varied in different ways. And then I would say, at any point, does this USB dongle actually send a keystroke to the host computer? And if it does, then I would record the last 30 seconds of radio packets that I sent to the USB dongle, and then work out exactly what I needed to send to it to get it to generate a keystroke. For the fuzzing, it was primarily with the NES controller, then later moved on to some custom firmware I wrote for these Nordic chips. So the most common type of transceiver in these devices is NRF24L family from Nordic Semiconductor. And this is an easy-to-use, low-power, 2.4 gigahertz transceiver. The physical layer is similar to like a non-frequency hopping Bluetooth, kind of similar to Bluetooth Low Energy. And you have a bunch. So you have, on a high level, the LE1 and LU1 variant. So LE1 for embedded, these are without a USB controller, then LU1 with USB controller. They all have an embedded 8050 microcontroller. They all have an AES coprocessor. But then you have some variation in memory here, and this ended up being a problem for a lot of the vendors. So some of the vendors, well, Logitech and some of the Dell products use flash memory variants of these chips. And the flash chips, you can write them once at the factory and then rewrite them later, which means you can do firmware updates in the field. But they're more expensive than the one-time programmable chips. So a lot of the vendors use these OTP chips, which you can write once at the factory, but due to the fact that it's one-time writable memory, you can't update firmware on those devices in the field. And this is the main reason why most of the devices that I've found vulnerabilities in aren't patched and can't be patched. So the package provided chips is pretty straightforward. You have a preamble, you have a 3, 4, or 5 byte address, you have a header, which has your sequence number and payload length, you have a 0 to 32 byte payload, and then a 1 or 2 byte CRC. And then there's a MAC layer functionality built in. So you have automatic hacking and automatic retransmit. So if you're using one of these chips, you can say, I want to send these bytes to this address, use this ACK timeout, and retry this many times before failure. And so it's really easy to use. And I think that's, the ease of use and low power is, made it attractive to a lot of these vendors. And what's nice is despite the fact that you have all these variants of how you can configure the Nordic chips, all of the vendors have standardized or use the same physical layer configuration. So they all have a 2 megabit data rate, 5 byte address length, 2 byte CRC, they use automatic hacking and retransmit. And despite the fact that the vendor stuff changes in what channels it uses and what data it actually sends, the standardized physical layer configuration means the same fuzzing tools can apply to all these different products. So Logitech Unifying, I think, is the most interesting of these protocols, just because it has a lot going on. So I'm going to touch on that for a minute. So the thing that distinguishes it is this concept of universal pairing. So the idea is that you can pair any Logitech Unifying keyboard or mouse with any Logitech Unifying dongle. And it's backward compatible. So if you have a mouse from 2009, pair it with a dongle from 2016. So all of the dongles support firmware updates, but most of the keyboards and mice do not. And this is an interesting problem because you can update the firmware to fix problems with the dongle, but you can't make general protocol changes because you can't update most of the keyboards and mice. So some of the vulnerabilities with Logitech were things that could fix in the firmware, and some that can't fix because it would be breaking the protocol. Some of the Logitech stuff uses these TI chips. They're functionally the same, basically the same type of vulnerabilities that affect the Nordic-based devices, also based devices. In terms of encryption, all of the mice are unencrypted from Logitech. The keyboard multimedia keys are unencrypted, so this would be play, pause, volume buttons for some reason are unencrypted on the keyboards, and just the regular 104 keys are encrypted on the keyboards. And then when you pair a Logitech keyboard with the Logitech dongle, there's a key generation process that happens during pairing. And I haven't characterized exactly how this key generation process works, except that some data is exchanged and both the keyboard and dongle wind up with the same AES key. Maybe it's not so secure is my gut feeling on that. So then all of the Logitech Unifying payloads are based on the same base packet format. They all use it, and then they have either 5, 10, or 22 byte payloads. And then within each payload, you have a 1 and this because you have a 2 byte CRC on the outer enhanced shock burst packet, and then they added their own checksum. But they all have those 3 payload links. And then the addressing is pretty straightforward. So on these Nordic chips and the TI chips, you have a 4 byte chip ID, which is programmed into the chip at the factory, and this uniquely identifies each chip. So Logitech then uses this for the upper of the RF address of the dongle, and then the dongle in each paired device gets its own unique device index. So the dongle is always at device index 0. If you go buy a new mouse, it's going to be pre-paired at device index 7. And then as you pair new devices, that last increments. And so each device has its own unique wireless address. But this has kind of a problem for Logitech, because you can have the Nordic chips listening to 6 receive addresses at once. You can pair 6 devices with the dongle, but the dongle also has to listen to its own address. So you have 7 addresses that the dongle listens on, but it can only listen to 6. So the way they've dealt with this, listen on 5 paired devices at a time, and they have this kind of alternate addressing scheme. So if I turn on my mouse, it's trying to talk to the dongle. The dongle is listening on these 5 other devices' addresses. Mouse will then send a message to the dongle address and put the mouse device index in the first byte of the payload and tell the dongle, hey, I'm here, turn on. So the thing about it, and you can send any packet that you would send to the address of a paired keyboard or mouse, you can also send that to the address of the dongle. And then we have this problem where the dongle needs to send commands to the mouse or keyboard sometimes, but the mouse and keyboard are always in transmit mode except when they're receiving ACK from the dongle. And the dongle is always in receive mode except when it's transmitting ACK to the mouse or keyboard. So what this means is that the dongle can't just actively send a command to the keyboard or mouse if it's not in active communication. So a normal exchange of, say, keep instead of replying with a 0-byte ACK, the dongle can reply with an ACK payload and send a command to the mouse or keyboard. So we have an example of this here. We have in green, we have some keep-alive packets that the mouse is sending to the dongle. Dongle is ACKing in blue. And then here, instead of sending a keep-alive, instead of sending an empty ACK, the dongle sends this command back to the mouse. The mouse then replies with a response and so forth. And so you can have two-way communication between the dongle and the mouse or keyboard, but only when the mouse or keyboard is on and actively communicating with the dongle. And then we have this dynamic keep-alive setup for power management. So Bluetooth, one of the reasons Bluetooth keyboard or mouse is going to have relatively worse battery life is Bluetooth physical layer means it's always going to be transmitting. So it's always hopping around these 9 channels and stuff to the host computer. These devices with these proprietary protocols are able to operate on lower power because they can do this dynamic power management stuff. So a mouse or keyboard will say, send a message to the dongle saying, I'm going to use this keep-alive interval. It will then send a keep-alive within that interval. If the dongle misses a keep-alive, it's going to assume that has happened, change channels, and then the mouse or keyboard will follow to find the dongle. So if you're idle, you can send keep-alives every second or so because you don't need to be responsive. But if you're actively moving the mouse or typing on the keyboard, you need much shorter keep-alives so that if you have to change channels, you can keep up. And doing this, the mice and keyboards are able to do a good job of managing their own power consumption. So here I have an example of this. So we have some mouse movement packets in blue, and then it steps off to this 110 millisecond keep-alives. After 5 seconds, steps off to 1.2 millisecond keep-alives. And we can take advantage of this keep-alive setup doing keystroke. That we have a mouse that's talking to a dongle or a keyboard talking to a dongle, and we want to spoof that device. We want to make sure that the dongle stays on our channel. So what we can do is set is using. We'll always pay attention to our keep-alive and not the paired device keep-alive. And so all the logic. Then for pairing, it's pretty straightforward. If you're a user and you're pairing a device, you bring up this Logitech unifying software on, I think it only supports OS X and Windows, and then you hit this button, Pair New Device. And this tells the dongle to listen for pairing addresses on this address. So for the next 30 to 60 seconds, if any pairing request comes in from the pairing address, the dongle will accept it, and it will pair that to the dongle. Then from the mouse or keyboard standpoint, when you turn your device on, it first tries to ping its dongle. If it can't ping the dongle it's paired with, it then tries to send out a pairing request. So you need to have things happen. You need to have the dongle in pairing mode, and you need to have the device you're trying to pair not be in range of the dongle it's already paired with. So now that we have some, for all this, let's look at some of these vulnerabilities. So the first set here are what I call encrypted protocols with unencrypted injection. And when I say encrypted protocol, I mean a protocol where the keyboard packets are normally encrypted, but it's possible to send unencrypted keyboard packets to USB dongle and generate a key press. So first we have this vulnerability affecting the Logitech unifying keyboards as well as the Dell KM714 set. And in this case, we're just sending unencrypted keyboard USB HID packets to the RF address of a keyboard that's paired with a Logitech USB dongle. And the problem is, if somebody's out and about in a coffee shop, they're not likely to have a keyboard with them, but we need a keyboard paired with the dongle in order to do this keystroke injection. But if they have a Logitech mouse, it turns out that we can pair our own keyboard with their dongle. And so remember, there is this fixed pairing address, but it turns out that the Logitech unifying dongles will accept pairing requests on any address it's listening to. So if you can overhear the address of a paired dongle, you can then send a pairing request to the address of that mouse, pair your own keyboard with the victim's USB dongle, and then start injecting keystrokes into that. And then we have this problem of what if they see a keyboard show up on their computer. So during the pairing process, the pairing device fully describes itself and its capabilities. So this is the device name, display name, the device serial number, what its capabilities are. And so you can actually pair a device that shows up as the same mouse they already have paired with their unifying dongle, but is actually a keyboard. So it shows up in the unifying software as a mouse, but is functionally a keyboard. So we notified Logitech of these vulnerabilities last November and did a public disclosure in February. Logitech released a firmware update in February which partially fixed the vulnerabilities. It fixed the forced pairing bug, but it did not fix the keystroke injection bugs. So it turned out there was a few ways to bypass this keystroke injection fix. So it was a firmware update to the dongle, but it only worked with certain OSs. So if you're using Linux or using OS X, the vulnerability was still there. And my favorite thing here is that if you had a clean install of Windows and you had this updated firmware on the Logitech dongle, the keystroke injection bug was fixed. But the moment you installed the Logitech setpoint software on that same computer, the injection attack started working again. And so it turned out what happened is their setpoint software was installing some kind of a keyboard filter driver, which put the dongle in some state where it was again accepting unencrypted keystrokes. So we notified Logitech of these bypasses in April, publicly disclosed these in July. They've done another firmware update in July, which fixed the unencrypted keystroke injection bug on all the OSs that I've tested on. And then we have this Logitech G900 Chaos Spectrum mouse. And this is a $150 gaming mouse. And I mean, granted, it feels good to use and all that, but I would never be able to justify that much money on a mouse myself. And when they were releasing this, they had this big press campaign. And they were calling it professional grade wireless. And I really wanted to know, what the hell does that mean? So it turns out it's just unifying with all the knobs turned up. So unifying has 24 channels, so they drop that down to 8 so that when the mouse needs to go find the dongle after it retunes, it's lower search space. They have shorter act timeout, so 1 millisecond instead of 8 millisecond minimum act timeout. And then they use the TI variants of the chips, which have a little bit higher transmit power, like an additional 4 dB gain. But it's really unifying without pairing. So I got this G900 mouse, and I immediately tried this unencrypted keystroke injection bug that affected the Logitech unifying keyboards. And sure enough, that worked. And then they have this gaming software, which is, it's pretty cool. And it allows you to customize a bunch of things about the mouse. So it can be like the LEDs you can change the color on, and you can customize different mouse buttons. But what's really neat is you can actually program macros into the mouse. And so you get a maximum of approximately 40 to 60 keys. And you can program a macro. The macro is stored in the mouse itself. So once it's programmed, it has no relation to the computer. And you push the button on the mouse, and the mouse itself knows what this keystroke macro is. So it turns out that you can actually program a macro into the mouse without any encryption or authentication. And so an attacker can then wirelessly program a macro into somebody's mouse and then have it execute a command the next time they're using their computer. So we notified Logitech of these G900 vulnerabilities in April, publicly disclosed in July. They fixed the unencrypted keystroke injection bug. By fixing that, they introduce an encrypted keystroke injection bug. And they have not fixed the malicious macro programming bug. So now we have some other cases of unencrypted keystroke injection into mice. So with the Logitech unifying keyboard stuff, that was sending keystrokes to the keyboard address on a dongle. And this is a case where we have, we can send unencrypted keystrokes to the USB dongle of a mouse with no keyboard associated to it. So this affects the Amazon Basics wireless mouse, Dell KM632, Lenovo 500, and most Microsoft wireless mice. And the Microsoft stuff, so I've got this Sculpt Ergonomic mouse, and it has this Windows button here. And so it turns out when you press the Windows button on this mouse, it sends an unencrypted keystroke packet over the air. So this will find this vulnerability because I simply press the button, observe the keystroke packet, change the character code from the Windows key to something else, and verify that you can then do a keystroke injection into these Microsoft mice. And this affects the Microsoft mice from the current AES encrypted generation of products, as well as the older XOR encrypted generation of products. So we notified Amazon in November, publicly disclosed in February, no response from Amazon. We notified Dell in November and publicly disclosed in February. Dell uses these OTP chips, so they can't do firmware updates in the field. They did fix the firmware on this device going forward and sent us a new unit to test, but devices already on the market will remain vulnerable. Same kind of deal with Lenovo, except Lenovo went as far as sending an engineer to our office to see how we did this research and what our methodology was. And so I have a lot of respect for Lenovo with this. Microsoft was super silly, so they released this Windows update in April. And the problem is they have these OTP chips on their devices as well, so they can't do firmware updates. So Microsoft's solution was to do a Windows update. So of course that doesn't fix anything for Linux or OS X. And it only works on some versions of Windows and some products. So if you have a server version of Windows, the update does not apply. If you have a wireless mouse that you purchased as part of a mouse and keyboard set, remains vulnerable. But if you have a wireless mouse from Microsoft that you purchased separate of a mouse and keyboard set and are using a client version of Windows 7 or newer, then you're fixed. Then we have these denial of service bugs affecting some Lenovo devices. And what's interesting about this is that you have these 3 products, and they're made from 3 different OEMs. So they're 3 different companies in China, or 2 in China, 1 in Taiwan, who make these mice and keyboards. But they all have the same bug in them. Different protocols over the air, but same variant of this vulnerability. And so the way this works, you send a wireless packet of a specific length to the USB dongle. Doesn't matter what the payload is, as long as the packet comes in of a certain length, then it crashes the firmware on the dongle until it's reseated. And so this affects these 3 products from Lenovo and something that they aren't addressing. So now we have cases where we can actually do our own encrypted keystroke injection. And this is pretty fun because you would assume that if you have an AES encrypted keyboard, that it's going to be secure. But it turns out that there are some implementation flaws in how these vendors have done this. So with counter mode AES, the way it typically works is you have your nonce and your counter, and these are concatenated and become your initialization vector. So the nonce is going to be, in this case, a fixed 11-byte sequence that lives. It's going to be static across all devices from a vendor. You have a counter, which is a 5-byte value, which is unique for each packet sent by the keyboard. So these are concatenated. They're encrypted using the AES key generated during the pairing process. And then you get your ciphertext. You then XOR the data with the ciphertext, and then the output is sent over the air. And so the way the counter incrementation is supposed to work is that you have the dongle should only accept incrementing counters between each 2 packets. So the idea is that this prevents a replay attack. If you can say this counter was the same as last time, therefore don't accept this. But a lot of the vendors have not enforced this. And so on the surface, that gives us a replay attack. But due to the way the USB HID packets are structured, we can do some pretty cool stuff. So when you type a key on a keyboard, you're going to have 2 packets sent to the USB dongle. You're going to have a key packet and then a key up packet. And these are going to be sequential in the counter. They're going to come one to the other in time. And so when you have the key down packet, the USB HID data is going to be either the key code or the key code plus modifiers. And the key up packet is going to be all zeros. So what happens is these keyboards are XORing the ciphertext with all zeros and sending that over the air. So that means is you have your ciphertext and your counter sent over the air. You can then XOR your own data with that same ciphertext, send it with the counter, and the dongle will accept it as a genuine encrypted keystroke packet. So this vulnerability affects all of the boards, the Dell KM632, Lenovo UltraSlim, Amazon Basics wireless keyboard, and then the HP Wireless Elite V2 has a similar but slightly more complicated vulnerability. So we notified these vendors in April and publicly disclosed in July. Logitech and Lenovo are both working on a fix. In the case of Logitech, because it's baked into their protocol and they can't update the keyboards, it's tricky for them to do. So when you power cycle a Logitech keyboard, it generates a new counter each time you turn it off and then back on. And so they can't really enforce incrementing counters there. Lenovo, I'm not sure what the status is there. Dell fixed this by installing a new wireless protocol under their keyboards. I suspect that it's potentially problematic, but it does address this specific bug. No response from Amazon, and no acknowledgement of the vulnerability from HP. So now we have cases where we have completely unencrypted keyboards. And these have come on the market as recently as last year, and they have no encryption whatsoever. They're just sending data in clear text. And so when I started looking at these devices, I was expecting to first do some physical layer stuff and then start looking at some protocol problems like the other devices. So you have these three families of transceivers here. You have some from Mozart Semiconductor, some one from Signia, and then some mystery transceiver, GE Jasco product. These transceivers were undocumented, so it first required reverse engineering the physical radio layer of these transceivers. And it turns out they're all low data rate, narrowband, GFSK modulation, a couple of frequency hopping. But the thing that really blew my mind is that these are completely unencrypted. So anything using these transceivers is going to be unencrypted and vulnerable to keystroke sniffing and injection. And so for the Mozart-based devices, from Anker, Eagletech, HP, Insignia, Kensington, and Radio Shack. And then we have a couple which use the same boards, but only use for mouse stuff. So you can do keystroke injection into those two mice and then keystroke sniffing with the rest of those keyboards. Then we have the non-Mozart one. So we have this GE Jasco product. And there's a company called Jasco. They manufacture these keyboards and mice, and then they license the GE name. So it's not actually GE making it, even though it says GE on the product. We have a Gigabyte wireless keyboard and mouse. This was one case where they used the Nordic transceivers with no encryption. And then we have this Toshiba wireless keyboard and mouse, which uses this Signia transceiver with no encryption. So with these Mozart transceivers, there's this really cool feature. It's a TDMA setup. And so when you have the dongle plugged into the computer, it's always sending these synchronization packets out for the keyboard to find. So the idea is that the keyboard can then receive these synchronization packets and learn what channel to transmit on, and also learn what timing to transmit on. So the keyboard will always transmit a keystroke immediately after one of these sync packets. But what's nice is that you have these dongles that are beaconing at a high duty cycle 100% of the time when the computer's on. So this means that you can show up in an environment and very, very quickly discover all of the keyboards that are, all the computers that are using these unencrypted Mozart-based keyboards. And just as you can do a very, very quick discovery of all these computers, you can also use one receiver to either multiple HDR dongles or an SDR to sniff multiple keyboards at once. And so it'd be conceivable for somebody to park outside of a business and record all of their keystrokes from all of their computers using these unencrypted keyboards. So Anker, they offered to exchange their vulnerable keyboards for Bluetooth models for around a 30-day period in August. I'm not sure how many people took them up on that. Kensington claims that they have an AES encrypted version of their vulnerable keyboard. I'm certain they do not, because it does not exist in the FCC docs. I have not seen this device. Insignia was telling reporters that their keyboards are encrypted, when they most certainly are not. And then GE Jasco is not addressing the problem because they have stopped making wireless keyboards and mice. So one thing I've been asked a lot is if I think it's likely that there are a lot of other vulnerabilities of these same types in devices that I haven't examined. And I think it's very likely. And the reason is that you have a lot of these devices aren't made by the vendors that sell them. So here, for example, we have the HP Wireless Classic Desktop. And then on the right, we have the OEM version from Acrox, which is the company that actually makes it. And so the presumption is that the same firmware is going to be on both the OEM and the vendor-specific models with the same vulnerabilities. Then we have the Amazon Basics wireless keyboard and mouse, and it's made by this OEM called Chicone. Chicone also makes the Dell KM632 set. And Amazon Basics have the identical vulnerabilities. So the assumption here is that Chicone is probably using the same vulnerable firmware across different products with different vendors' names on them. And then we have another case here, the Radio Shack keyboard and the OEM equivalent. So through this project, I've both consumed and developed some different open source tools for exploring these devices and doing this type of security research. And my favorite hardware tool is this thing called a Crazy Radio PA. So there's this project called the Crazy Fly. It's an open source quadcopter project. And it's based on the Nordic Semiconductor NRF24L transceivers. And they use this USB dongle to talk to the drone. But what's nice, it has the Nordic chip, but also has an amplifier on it. So you can get pretty good range with this. And doing some range testing, we were able to do keystroke injection with 100% accuracy at 225 meters away using a directional antenna and one of these Crazy Radio dongles. And so we had some vendors telling the media and their consumers that these kind of attacks only work from 10 or 20 meters away. So we had Reuters film us doing an attack on the street of San Francisco at 225 meters away and hopefully dispel that. But the Crazy Radio, great little device. The problem is, after the MouseJack news came out, they became hard to find and more expensive because it's a it's not a mass-produced item. So I was able to work out, for here, I wrote some proprietary firmware that runs on their Crazy Radio dongles or any other NRF24L based chip. So it's basically a simple Python API that allows you to control the USB dongle from a Python script and do device discovery, packet reception, packet transmission, that kind of thing. And then I figured out how the firmware update process works for the Logitech unifying dongles, because they use the same Nordic transceiver as a Crazy Radio dongle. And so I updated my firmware, and you can actually now run sudo make Logitech install and flash my custom firmware onto a Logitech unifying dongle, use it for whatever research purposes, and then flash it back to the original Logitech firmware so you can keep it with your mouse and keyboard primarily, but then use it for this kind of research when you want. And this is a pretty low barrier to entry way to get into this stuff, because it's a $10 dongle and a few lines of shell code. And then the problem is you have the ability to only receive one channel at a time with these NRF24L hardware dongles. So I implemented a out-of-tree GNU radio module called gr-nordic, and this makes it possible to do packet transmission and reception between a SDR and these Nordic chips. So you can do two-way communication. There's some ACK timeouts that you can't meet just due to these timing constraints, but you can do two-way communication in a lot of scenarios. This is up on GitHub. A Wireshark dissector that talks to the GNU Radio out-of-tree module. So this means you can run the GNU Radio module and pipe the result into Wireshark, and then get visibility into these wireless keyboards and mice in an environment with the familiar Wireshark tools. So now I have a number of demos prepared. So first, I would like to show the gr-nordic tool here and demonstrate sniffing some packets from this Microsoft wireless mouse using this USRP software-defined radio. And so I hadn't written any Wireshark dissectors before this. There's a language called Lua, simple scripting language. You can actually write Wireshark dissectors in Lua, very, very easy, maybe 25 lines of code for what I put together, and none of the pain of having to recompile all of Wireshark and do a bunch of crazy C code. So I'll start up Wireshark here. Now I'm going to run a script here which will invoke the gr-nordic receiver, and this looks for these. This will hop around the specific channels that the Microsoft wireless mice use. Once it finds a mouse, hopefully this one here, then it will hop. It will hop to follow that mouse as it changes channels. So I'll start this here. Okay, and so now it's starting to cycle through these different channels that the mouse is potentially using. So now it's found the address of this mouse here and recording some packets. So I will stop the gr-nordic receiver here, go back over to Wireshark, and now we have a bunch of packets here in Wireshark. So we can pull up one of these, which is dissected for Microsoft mouse movement and click, and then we can see the direction of movement and the state of the buttons and so forth. And for all these payloads which are unencrypted, it's pretty trivial to work out what the format is and get some interesting insight here. So now I'll pull out this Logitech mouse here. So what I'm going to do is flash my custom firmware onto this Logitech USB dongle, and then do an injection attack with that, and then return it back to the original state, which is super convenient. So, okay, we'll plug this in here. So we have, regular mouse, but now we can go and do sudo make Logitech install, and this will flash my custom firmware onto this Logitech unifying dongle. Okay, so that was successful. And so now, there are a bunch of different things you can do for attacks. One platform I really like is Android. So I built this Android app that can then use this little low-profile USB OTG adapter and actually do a keystroke injection attack into the dongle from this Microsoft wireless mouse using this Logitech dongle and this Android phone. So pull this up here. So the way this works on a general level, the Android app will enumerate devices in the area and give a list of devices that it sees. And then I have it set up for this version of it where I can actually do some keystroke injection. So I'm going to open up gedit here. And then so I have this mouse with the USB dongle and this computer. And then I'm going to be executing an attack, or at least doing some keystroke injection from this Android phone here. So I'll run this. And then this is sending keystrokes from the USB dongle in the Android phone to the Microsoft dongle in a laptop to type on somebody's computer. And with you get better range in general with a regular desktop or laptop computer. With the Logitech dongles, it's about the same for both cases. With the crazy radio dongles, the power amplifier chip on there requires more power than most phones will spit out over USB OTG. So it's kind of hit or miss. So with the crazy radio dongles, definitely computer is the way to go. But with these little Logitech dongles, it's such a low profile to use it on an Android phone. It's kind of fun. And then I'll go back here and put the original Logitech firmware back on this dongle, and then we can use the mouse again. And so for this, there's a script I have, which you simply pass in the firmware image that you've downloaded from Logitech, and it will get everything set up. This is putting the Logitech firmware back on. And then we are back to a regular mouse that we can use. All right, well, that is what I have. Any questions?
So just basically keep your wired mouse.
Yeah, that's the rule of thumb. I haven't looked at any Bluetooth stuff. There haven't been many or any published Bluetooth mouse or keyboard vulnerabilities, at least the last number of years. But I think that's because people just haven't looked at those devices as much. The tools for fuzzing the Bluetooth protocol are not nearly as available as something like these proprietary protocols. So you can get the Ubertooth and do reception that way, but you can't do two-way communication and fuzzing as easily. And so I suspect if people had looked at Bluetooth mice and keyboards that they would find some things, but nobody's done that as far as I'm aware.
Have you seen any of the stuff outside of the lab?
Oh, yeah. So at the RSA conference in, oh, you mean in terms of attacks?
Yeah.
No, I've seen tons of devices in the wild, but haven't seen any attacks in the wild. There are a pair of researchers who put together a tool called Jacket. So it's a Python tool there, and they have a so I've looked at that a bit. It's a pretty neat tool they put out. It's the most weaponized thing I've seen.
The attacks work with USB dongle currently plugged in.
Yep.
Is there enough memory in the mouses and the keyboards that you can load a payload so when it next plugged in your computer, you're now given remote access to it?
So the only case where you could do something like that would be the macro programming bug on the gaming mouse, where you can execute a command, but there's no way that I've discovered to actually store any kind of commands on the dongle itself. But in the case of Logitech, for example, trivial thing would be to have some firmware that you execute keystroke commands to update the firmware to custom firmware on the dongle, and then do something that way. So, but nothing outside of that I'm aware of.
I saw this talk when you gave it at DEF CON.
Oh, cool, thanks, yeah.
Yeah, so I think you were selling
I made a few. I was having conversations with some people to be producing one that ever came together. But that said, it's
that's what everyone's saying.
and the big problem is that it's just a pain in the ass to build things because it's
Like a lot in it.
yeah. And actually, let me go back to a picture of this here. So.
Or like the plans on GitHub would be cool.
Yeah, exactly, and that I definitely might do because I have like partially put together instructions for these. I guess I don't know. Okay, so the material here on the front of the controller is really, really heat sensitive, and so if you get it too hot, the texture there turns into this smooth surface. And so I had several controllers nearly finished that I had to start over on because I had the heat gun or hot glue gun or soldering iron or something too close to it and would give these weird splotches on the front. And then the plastic is really soft, so you have to, well, you either have to keep it closed or strip the screws immediately. So later revisions had, you know, some brass screw posts on there. And I think the point is that it would be a neat thing if there were an easy way to, you know, mass produce it without spending a weekend burning my fingers in the lab.
Yeah, the blueprints and the plans for it would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll definitely check with work next week. I don't think there'd be any IP concerns there. So that'd be good. Yeah, definitely it's fun to have the nostalgia of the NES controller while still doing something, you know, interesting like that.
What else do you use your B210 for?
Listening to everything radio.
Yeah.
So we do protocol decoders for all kinds of different protocols, but then I use the B board mostly for researchy stuff. Then I have a couple N210s at home, which I'm a big fan of as well, but just not as portable. No, they were free from the Spectrum Challenge, which is the only reason I have them. that was my initial goal. Is if I qualified as a finalist, I would get some neat toys and then maybe learn how to use them, and it worked out. Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you. So, have you given any recommendations to companies on how they should secure this stuff?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations with the vendors. Some of them, I think a lot of the vendors we didn't hear back from, I suspect it's because they don't actually make the products themselves. They have some OEM do it, so they don't have any ownership over the firmware or even the hardware design process. In the case of Insignia, they were telling reporters that their keyboards are encrypted, and I think they were just misinformed by the OEM. So I think the reason that Logitech was able to be so proactive about it and actually fix some of these things is because they have full ownership of the whole supply chain, firmware, hardware, and knowledge of how their products work.